This has been the age of the awakening of human consciousness. Interesting that the Bible is one of the few historical accounts that we have that dates all the way back to the beginning of the age. We do have historical accounts that begin not too long after the beginning of the age, but the Bible is one of the only accounts we have that even attempts to delineate the very beginning of this age and the awakening of human consciousness that kick-started the age. So when we look at the Bible, we have to understand that it's not historical in the sense of necessarily of actual people and actual events. It's parabolic, and what that means is that the Bible is describing to us not only the major things that took place in the beginning, but also the trends of our state of consciousness that would propel us forward into this fully into this age. And it's interesting because the Hebrew scholars that were responsible for writing the Old Testament, they actually have dated the beginning of the age through genealogies, and so we know basically on a timeline how old the age is, and it's getting very near now to 6,000 years old. But what's really important about the Bible is what it shows us about human consciousness. And I think that it's very clear, according to biblical accounts, as we will see in this talk, it's very clear that human consciousness is an amazing endowment that we have. It's very powerful, and it has created a very unique world. So let's go back to the beginning and look at it a little bit. According to the parabolic account of the Bible, of the Old Testament. And what we see is one man named Adam, that the Bible names Adam, which is, by the way, the Hebrew term for man. So we have Adam, or man, finding himself in a beautiful garden. And right away, we have to understand that this was a very unique situation. Man, the species of Homo sapien, predated Adam by many, many, many years. And what man was prior to Adam was more like an animal, a very intelligent animal. But what really made man unique, according to the Bible, is that he was created differently than all the other species of animals. And the thing that made man different was an endowment of spiritual consciousness housed within the human psyche. And before Adam, it's obvious that mankind had this endowment because it was put inside of him at creation, during the act of creation. So pre-Adam man had spiritual consciousness, but that spiritual consciousness, being evolutionary in nature, had not yet awoken to the point of influencing human behavior or even human feelings or the human psyche. It was just lying dormant. And so we see pre-Adam man acting very much like the rest of the animal kingdom, um, except with more intelligence, but still behavior that was not unique necessarily. More like human beings gathered more in tribes and more in communities that were totally unsophisticated and without government, without any kind of the things that we have come now to understand about human behavior. But my personal belief is what happened is that there was one man out of this entire community of Homo sapiens that were on the earth. There was one man who the time had come for his endowment of consciousness to awaken. And when I say awaken, I mean that it was alive suddenly, like a light going on. And prior to this time, human consciousness was not powerful. It was just lying dormant. But one man experienced this powerful awakening because human consciousness at that point could be seen to be extremely powerful. And the first thing we see that sets Adam apart is that he finds himself in the Garden of Eden. And this is a strange thing because the rest of the earth isn't like the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden was special and it was very beautiful and it was a set apart environment that as soon as Adam's consciousness awoke, suddenly he found himself there. And it was such a pristine environment, and his lifestyle there was also pristine. He didn't need to fight for survival. He didn't need to fend for himself in the animal kingdom. Everything was provided for him. He didn't need to build fires at night because it was perfectly climate controlled. And so all of a sudden we see that awakened consciousness had a creative power. It had the power to create an environment that was totally unique and that no other animal would be able to not only create but even to inhabit. And so then the story in the Bible goes on to say that to show us that not all was perfectly pristine in the Garden of Eden. In other words, the endowment of consciousness was actually not just powerful for good and for a pristine environment, for creating a pristine environment. It was also had some very complex aspects to it. And one of those complex aspects was uh, the the possibility of temptation, because prior to human consciousness going on and in becoming enlightened in the garden, uh, temptation was not a factor for human beings. But human consciousness, once awoken, was so powerful that Adam found himself struggling at times with how to handle how to relate to the power that was at work within him. And so he didn't really understand uh, what was happening and everything that he was going through and feeling. But as the Bible describes, there came along a creature, a serpent, that informed him, basically, of what was happening and why his life was suddenly so complex, and informed him of the potentialities of human consciousness. And so when Adam was informed, it became a choice. He was faced with a choice, because the temptation was that this endowment of consciousness was so great that Adam could become like God. And and Adam, prior to awakening, didn't know God. But after awakening, it's very interesting that part of human consciousness's qualities was a natural communion with God. And so we see in that story that routinely Adam would walk with God in among the trees of the garden. But the temptation that was brought to him, the potentiality of his endowment of consciousness, if he were to give full expression to it in a certain way, was that he could become like God. And so all of this is nothing, it's not that unusual when we understand what consciousness is and how powerful it is. It's not that unusual that Adam was tempted. It's not, he wasn't sinning, or he wasn't doing anything that was out of character when we understand the great power of human consciousness. He was actually acting very much in alignment with that. But then we go on to see that this idea, this temptation that he decided to explore and go with, changed a lot about his situation. It changed him, and uh, and this was the point where Adam adopted a state of consciousness, which is part of how consciousness works. It's evolutionary, and what Adam didn't realize in the beginning days in the garden was that he could actually enter a state of consciousness that would be very complex and very predictable in its outworking, and that this state of consciousness would actually be handed down to his descendants. So basically, what happened as all this was taking place and Adam became this new creature entering a state of consciousness that changed human life and behavior completely, is Homo sapiens branched out into a new race, a new race of beings. That's why it was genetically passed down, because once Adam entered this state of consciousness, it was racial. It became a race passed down to all of his descendants. And this is what helps us to understand that the coming age, or the age that was coming as Adam was experiencing this, the age that we are now living in, was the result of this transformation, of a racial transformation, and that we have never varied from this state of consciousness. This has been the age of awakened consciousness, but it has been the age in which we have always held true to the racial qualities of Adam's consciousness, of his state of consciousness. So right away, things changed dramatically inside of him. And this brought, because consciousness is creative from the inside outward, this brought changes in his environment. One of the things that Adam suddenly felt different about was that he suddenly uh, he saw himself being naked and became ashamed. And shame was not something that pre Adam man would have ever experienced. Um, this was part of his endowment of consciousness expressing itself in this new state, this new racial outworking. And what this shows us is that we tend to believe that consciousness is perfectly benign, that it's almost a holy endowment that we have, that only exerts itself on certain occasions. But the truth about consciousness is that it's power. And it's a power for many different things. It's a power for complexity, and it's a power for creating both good and evil. At least that's what happened after Adam entered his state of consciousness, is that he became aware of good and evil. He became knowledgeable. And so this shows that consciousness is not always pure and good. It's just a power. And we need to relate to it as it's almost like a keg of dynamite. Uh, we tend to not even be aware of its power. But right away, Adam saw that something was happening inside of him, emotions. Of course, mankind had emotions previously, but this was a keg of dynamite when it came to emotion. It was so intensified after he awoke to his endowment of consciousness. So shame is an emotion, and it was so strong when he saw that he was naked that he immediately took action. And this is very important, because what we see here about his state of consciousness is that it was there's so much going on inside of him at this point that he feels compelled to take action. It's not a question. It's not, well, I'm going to decide to do this or that. It was compelled, and he acted. And that has been a major trait of human consciousness ever since, is that we are compelled by what's going on inside of us due to consciousness. We are so compelled that the first thing we do is to feel that we have to take action. So this is an orientation of what I call human strength that has never let up in this entire age of man. But there were other complications too. There were other complexities that were immediately known. And another one was that Adam suddenly felt the impulse to hide from God. And this is also very telling of the coming age, because why did Adam feel that way? Previously, he had walked with God in the garden routinely. But as soon as he entered this state of consciousness that in which he received the knowledge of good and evil and was tempted by it to become like God, suddenly God became an enemy. And this again is an outworking of consciousness and its power, is that Adam didn't have a choice in this. He didn't think, well, I don't feel like being with God today. He right away knew that he couldn't be with God in this new state of consciousness. And this was this was a great prophecy of what was to come throughout this entire age of human behavior, is that we have always felt throughout this age cut off from God and separate from God, and had the impulse to hide from God. And it's so complex, this dynamic, that we've never understood it, but we've been guilty about it. We've known that it's not right, and that's where religion comes in, is that we have tried throughout this age to get rid of this guilt that we don't want to be with God, that we want to hide from God. So anyway, as things went on, Adam's state of consciousness changed his environment. It transformed it. He was no longer creating an environment like the Garden of Eden. He suddenly found himself creating an environment that was reflective of his new state of consciousness, which involved good and evil, dualities. So his new environment that he created through his endowment of consciousness was totally reflective of dualities. Everything about it. It's light and dark. There are 12 hours of darkness and approximately 12 hours of light in each day. Heat and cold. Human relations suddenly reflected love and hate. And of course, good and evil was a complete overbearing kind of mental working that he now found himself experiencing. Everything, he would judge everything according to good and evil. And so the Bible shows that the environment of man suddenly changed and became reflective of his new state of consciousness. And then Adam and Eve began to have offspring. And this is when things really get interesting about this age, because their first two offsprings are both male, and their names are Cain and Abel. And they were very different in temperament from one another, but both were conscious beings. In other words, Adam's endowment of consciousness being awoken, this was a race quality that was handed down to their offspring. So both Cain and Abel were conscious. They were both had their endowment of consciousness very much at work, affecting their lives and their experience in life. But they were very different, which is also interesting because it shows that consciousness is capable of expressing itself in both good and evil. This is what Cain and Abel revealed, was that Abel tended to be very good. He tended to be very pure in heart and very upright in his actions. And Cain was tortured and tempted by consciousness. Abel was comfortable with it. It was the divine aspect of our consciousness didn't trouble Abel, but it did trouble Cain. And so Cain, what we see right away is that Cain, being feeling very guilty about God, decided to become religious. This was the first instance of human religion. He, just out of the blue, he decided to offer up a sacrifice to God. He was a tiller of the soil, so he offered up some of the fruits of his work, of his labors, to God, and in a religious ceremony. And Abel saw this going on, and he thought to himself, well, Cain, who was his older brother, must know something that Abel didn't know yet. And so, with perfect purity of heart, Abel decided to copy his brother and also offer up a sacrifice, thinking that maybe Cain knew something he didn't know. So Abel offered up, he was a shepherd, and he offered up one of the lambs from his flock to God. And as the story goes on, God received Abel's sacrifice with full goodness and rejected Cain's sacrifice. And of course, it wasn't that God liked meat better than vegetables. It was that God saw their hearts, and he saw that Abel was pure in heart and was offering up a sacrifice to God based on the pure desire for divine communion. But Cain had different motives, and his motives were not pure. So God rejected his offering. And what followed was very telling about this age. When Cain's offering was rejected, he became very angry and downcast. In other words, his emotions working through consciousness were so intense that he couldn't control them. And he was furious about it, because the way he saw it was that he was the one who had the idea to offer a sacrifice to God and try and ease their guilt. And it was his idea. He was the religious one, and yet God accepted Abel's sacrifice and rejected Cain's. So he was mastered by this intensity of emotion. And what followed was the first murder in human history, in which Cain knew that he couldn't do anything about God, but he could rid the earth of Abel. And that's what he decided to do. And this is a very telling event for the coming age, because what it shows the power of consciousness working inside of somebody like Cain so intensely through emotion and complex mental behaviors that it then caused him to take action that was uh, very uh, unparalleled in any action that human beings had ever taken before. And so this was an outworking of consciousness, and what it then became was a sort of pattern of human behavior that whenever human beings after Cain became troubled, or whenever they became angry or downcast or jealous, this was a behavioral uh, trait that would be carried forward into this age among all humanity. And so at that point, what we understand is that human beings were awakened to consciousness, but there were many different things going on. It wasn't just a wonderful thing. The environment was part of their struggle, was dealing with the dualities in their environment. Because when you think about it, just the simple duality of climatic climat climat climate change and climate influence, where there were now extremes of climate where heat and cold could no longer be tolerated being naked, but man needed to clothe himself, man needed to build shelters for himself. Life became very complex at that point, because those things, the need to build houses and shelters from the inclement weather, those things went forward to shape human civilization and to even impact our economic um, uh, policies and our economic systems. So, but this behavior of Cain was very telling, and basically it showed that we were in for an entire age of war in the human community. And this is part of consciousness's outworking. So obviously, consciousness is a power, but it's not just a power for good. It's a power that uh, when a human being like Cain becomes intensely affected and impacted by circumstance, and sets off an emotional, mental um, reaction within him that he can't control, human behavior becomes violent and it becomes warlike. And so, what was ahead was an entire age of this quality. And it's interesting because in the beginning, the Bible explains that human beings lived very long lifetimes. And most people relate to that as kind of like a fantastical aspect of the biblical narrative, like, oh, that didn't really happen, or if it did, it obviously wasn't, it was different human beings than we are. But it was the same race of human beings that we are. It's just that consciousness in its initial stages was so powerful that that death was not the kind of issue that it is now. In other words, the human character and the human uh, vessel that houses consciousness has changed, but the human essence of spiritual consciousness and that has stayed the same. But it ended up that at some point we our life expectancy came more into line with what it is now. But throughout this age, there have been wars, and there has been this violent tendency among men, but also uh, on the other end of the spectrum, there have been Ables. There have been many people who have, in the quietude of their own hearts, responded to this endowment of consciousness with goodness and with purity. And so the age of duality uh, has definitely played out in that way. And unfortunately, uh, the Ables of the world have been no match for their stronger brother, the Cains of the world, who have been tormented to the point of wanting to war. And so the Ables of the world have been mostly silenced and killed and eradicated and persecuted. Um, but this age has gone forward and played itself out, and um, we have uh, been always conscious throughout this age. We've had consciousness at work in us. And what we have to remember is that consciousness is evolutionary in nature. It was in the very beginning. That's probably what caused Adam, or the first man, to awaken, was this evolutionary quality of of consciousness. And consciousness didn't stop in this, but there has definitely been a reactionary response to the evolution of consciousness on the part of the Cains of the world. And that is that they have tried to stop the evolution of consciousness through social programs, uh, psychological conditioning, many different methods that they have employed to try to deceive humankind, first of all, about what consciousness is, or if it exists at all, or because the Cains of the world, being strong, have tended to prosper in this world. The world, the environment is full of riches, and so when Cain learned this, when the Cains of the world learned this, then the idea of accumulating wealth and power and control took hold of a major part of human society. And when this came into conflict between communities, then there was war. And so the entire age has been like this. But the evolution of consciousness has been at work. And that's why throughout this age, there have been some improvements in human life and in the human lifestyle. For instance, our struggle to survive in the beginning with extremes of climate, we have largely conquered that through the kind of houses that we build now and the kind of clothes that we have to wear. These are advances that were part of the evolution of consciousness. And there have also been many people throughout this age who have experienced the evolution of consciousness to the degree they've gone beyond able, not just to the degree of goodness, but to the degree of actually changing their orientation and behavior as conscious beings. In other words, Cain sort of set the pattern for this state of consciousness that we're in, but quietly behind the scenes, there have been many people who have gone forth into the realm and explored the realm of evolved consciousness. And interestingly enough, the Bible also deals with this and shows us that while Cain's influence over human society definitely has colored human existence for the past 6,000 years, this other thing has been going on too with the evolution of consciousness and knowledge of our ultimate destiny. And this is where Jesus came in, was that at some point in time, one of our own, just like Adam did in the beginning, one of our own changed states of consciousness and went into a new state of consciousness based on evolution, on the evolutionary instincts within him. He came into this new state of consciousness that we now call the Christ. We call him the Christ, but in truth, that title belongs to a state of consciousness. And it is a state of consciousness that is available for every human being. In other words, Adam entered into the first state that has defined this age, but within the human endowment of consciousness, there is the potentiality for the Christ, for the state of the Christ. And this is a wonderful, incredible, hopeful discovery that Jesus not only made for himself, but then showed. He displayed it for all of us to see. Because what it shows is the ultimate goodness, that could be that could come through consciousness. Human consciousness was not meant to be the curse that it has been during this age. The cruel strength that people like Cain have used consciousness to exert. That was not, um, yeah, human consciousness was capable of that, obviously, but ultimately, human consciousness is the consciousness of God. It's divine and it's glorious, and it's glorious in its demonstration because human consciousness is creative and always has been. And unfortunately, we created in our Adamic state, we created outward situations and conditions that were hard and were difficult and were not very nice. But ultimately, our state of consciousness in the Christ will create a whole new world, and it will be everything that we have ever dreamed of in our human ability to dream, that is good and is beautiful. And this is what Jesus showed us. And um, and then, of course, we know that history uh, since then has been clear, that though Jesus showed us Christ consciousness, that doesn't mean that human beings as a whole, as a society, as a race, were ready for or free to move on into that state yet. And so human society over the past 2,000 years is not much different than it was before Jesus came. But that doesn't mean that Christ consciousness is not still our destiny and our ultimate destiny, and it is still there, and we can still move toward it, and it will manifest. Jesus is the proof of that. That if we all we have to do is give way to our evolutionary instincts. In other words, all we have to do and have had to do throughout this age is to just move out of the way and stop trying to thwart our evolutionary instincts and let them hold sway over our experience, and they will bring us into this ultimate state. And so many people have experienced this, and the the defining moment will come not as individuals experience it, because many, with the help of Jesus's inspiration, many in the past 2,000 years have attained to Christ consciousness on their own, individually. But the defining uh, change is going to come when the collective of mankind sees these things as true, and has the strength to say no to the Cains of the world who want to continue on in Adamic consciousness, have the strength to say no, and to say we want something better. We want Christ consciousness, and we want a new world. And this is what is on the horizon for us, is this defining change, is when the collective of mankind actually embraces the Christ. And because we know by experience that human consciousness, is creative. And as soon as we come into the state of the Christ, we will create a whole new world. And it will not be anything like the world that we've had up until now.